North Africa was Justinian's first target in his dream to restore the Roman Empire. The campaign against the Vandals was swift and decisive. Belisarius landed, crushed the enemy, and marched into Carthage in triumph. It was everything Justinian wanted his reconquests to be: quick, clean, and glorious. But what followed was anything but. Within a decade, Africa descended into turmoil. Roman officers mutinied, Moorish tribes rose in revolt, and entire provinces burned. The prefecture that once had been the empire's most promising recovery became a quagmire of incompetence, rebellion, and blood. From this disaster emerged one of Justinian's most capable generals, John Troglita, whose campaigns would finally bring peace to the region and close the book on the Vandalic Wars. During the 540s, the Empire's enemies seemed to gain the upper hand in all theaters. In Africa, this was evident in the Moorish uprisings that resulted in the death of Solomon, the Praetorian prefect, in 544. After Solomon was killed in battle, Justinian appointed Sergius, Solomon's nephew, as his successor. The emperor made this choice to honor Solomon after his death, but it was a very poor decision. Sergius was, frankly, incompetent, and his inadequate leadership brought nothing but trouble. The Moors, meanwhile, were uniting under former Roman loyalists, such as Antulus, a chieftain who had been allied with the empire in the 530s, and Stotzus, a former Roman soldier who had led a mutiny due to the empire's lack of pay. Stotzus fled to Mauritania, married the daughter of a local chieftain, and later became chieftain of the tribe in his own right. The Roman army in North Africa was mostly garrisoned in fortified cities and towns. A large field army would have to be drawn from these urban garrisons, but Sergius was on very poor terms with all the local officers. No one wanted to spare their own men for his mobile army. And Sergius didn't really make any effort to repair these fractured relationships. So the Roman army remained disconnected and in defensive positions, giving the Moors free rein. Himerius, the head of the garrison in Hadramedum, attempted to organize a counterattack, but due to poor communication, he ended up marching right into a Moorish trap. Himerius was captured, and much of his army deserted into Antulus's ranks. This allowed the Moors to briefly take control of Hadramedum, but they abandoned the city when they heard false rumors of a Roman fleet approaching. Despite this disaster, which really should have been a wake-up call, Justinian refused to remove Sergius. He did, however, send fresh blood to Africa, in the form of Aribindis, a senator in Constantinople who was married to Justinian's niece. Aribindis did not have prior military experience, but he was put in charge of the military operations in North Africa with one straightforward order: put down the rebellion as quickly as possible. Sergius, though, was still the prefect, and he didn't like the idea of sharing power. When Aribindis arrived, Sergius marched his own men off to Numidia, far away from any threat, and left Aribindis very few men for his field army to take on the Moors. The small force would probably not have even embarked on the campaign had it not been led by John, the son of Siciniolus, who had a long-standing rivalry with Stotzus and was all too eager to march off against his sworn enemy. John caught up with Stotzus at Thasia, where the undermanned Romans suffered a minor defeat. John and Stotzus faced off in hand-to-hand combat as the battle neared its end, and John dealt his rival a fatal blow. But as he turned to retreat with the rest of his men, he fell from his horse and was killed by pursuing Moorish cavalry. The two hated rivals both met an end on the same field. News of this defeat finally convinced Justinian that Sergius wasn't the man for the job. He removed him from North Africa and sent him to Italy, because that's just what they did with the terrible leaders in the 540s. Aribindis was then given full command of Africa, both the military operations and the administrative operations. There was no one left to tell him no. Aribindis understood his own limits and his lack of experience in military affairs, so he chose Guntharus to head the Roman military operations. Guntharus was a Roman general of Vandal descent, but he was secretly conspiring with Antulus to assassinate Aribindis and split the African prefecture into two independent states. As part of the plan, Antulus began marching towards Carthage and was joined by Cutsonus, another Moorish chieftain. Cutsonus had been involved in this conflict for over a decade and had allied his people with both the Romans and the Moors at various points. Here, he appeared to be allied with Antulus. But at the same time, Cutsonus was secretly negotiating with Aribindis. And because Aribindis thinks Guntharus is working for him, he gladly tells Guntharus that Cutsonus is going to betray Antulus. And because Guntharus is actually working with Antulus, he tells Antulus that his ally is going to turn on him. But Antulus doesn't want to blow this whole thing up, so he continued his march towards Carthage with a known double agent by his side, knowing that he would be getting word of further developments from his own double agent within the city. With the Moors camped outside Carthage, Guntharus took control of one of the gates and rallied his men against Aribindis by blaming him for the late and short payments that had constantly plagued the army in the region. With Guntharus' men now on the verge of mutiny, a skirmish began with Aribindis' loyalists at the open gate. And this was actually the first time that Aribindis had witnessed any combat up close. And he was so uneasy by the sight of men killing each other that he ran away, taking refuge in a church. That's right, the man who Justinian had put in charge of the military campaign against the Moors was so squeamish that he ran off at the very first sight of battle. Real top-notch choice there. Aribindis' cowardice left the city in Guntharus' hands. He was eventually found by a priest who negotiated for his safety and allowed to return to the palace. Shortly after, he was murdered in his sleep by Guntharus' men. Guntharus then had Aribindis' head sent to Antulus, who was camped outside the city, as proof that Carthage was now in Guntharus' hands. But notably, Guntharus did not send Antulus any of the previously promised payments, and he made no mention of dividing North Africa as the two men had agreed. So basically, Guntharus got what he wanted, but Antulus was stuck outside Carthage with no leverage, knowing that Cutsonus was prepared to turn on him at any moment. So he turned his army around and returned to Byztory. Cutsonus then reached his own agreement with Guntharus and agreed to fight alongside his army against Antulus. But Guntharus' reign would only last for 36 days, as he was assassinated by Aribindis, one of Aribindis' lieutenants. This put Carthage back in the hands of imperial loyalists. Cutsonus maintained his agreement and would fight alongside the Romans in the future, but Antulus was still running wild in the south. This failed coup demonstrated that the entire prefecture was on the verge of going to pieces. Justinian responded to this mess by sending John Troglita to Africa to take command of the army. One of our main sources for John Troglita's life is an epic poem titled The Tale of John, or On the Libyan War, by Flavius Cresconius Corippus. And this work is often cited as the last classical Latin epic poem, so that's a cool little tidbit. Troglita had been in Africa with Belisarius and had also served under Solomon. He was very familiar with the territory and was one of the better appointments that Justinian made during this time period. He arrived in Carthage in late 546 and went right to work. He immediately gathered a force and set out for Byzacena, where he was met by representatives of Antyllus. These representatives threatened him with a war that they claimed he could not win. Antyllus was used to spineless Romans leading the operations in Africa, and probably assumed that Troglita would bargain. But he was wrong. Troglita reacted calmly and coldly, detained the ambassadors, broke camp, and marched on the enemy. The Moors retreated into the mountains, hoping that the terrain would give them the upper hand, but Troglita pursued and engaged, winning a decisive victory. Troglita then returned to Carthage for the winter and took the time needed to do what Sergius never did. He reorganized the military structure and ensured coordination of the Roman forces across the prefecture. The Moors used the winter months to regroup, and by the spring of 547, the raids had resumed in Tripolitania. So Troglita gathered a full force from his newly reorganized army and marched south to meet the threat. The Moors, smartly, avoided open battle and retreated into the desert. Troglita followed, attempting to end the rebellion right then and there, but his supply lines were quickly stretched thin and he had to retreat back to the coast. Troglita had planned to have his army resupplied by sea, his only real option. He was basically cut off from all the major cities. The Moors had led him through harsh desert, and the roads through here were at best in poor condition. At the empire's height, the Romans had constructed and maintained various storage depots that made travel along this stretch much more tolerable. But in the aftermath of the Vandal invasion, Belisarius's reinvasion, and the Moorish raids of the past decade, that infrastructure was no longer usable. The Romans controlled this part of the Mediterranean, though, and there was no way for the Moors to stop Roman ships from bringing much-needed supplies to Troglita's men. But unfortunately for the Romans, the Moors didn't need to stop the ships. Mother Nature did it for them. Adverse winds and storms hit the coast at the worst possible time, and this significantly hindered naval travel, leaving Troglita's men parched, hungry, and stranded in the desert. The desperate Roman army located a small stream running out towards the sea and attempted to make camp there, hoping that the little available water would be enough to sustain them in the short term. Troglita was immediately making plans to retreat to safety. The thing about desert heat, though, is that it affects everyone. The Moors needed water too, and they also approached this stream hoping for some relief. Roman officers saw this as an opportunity. The enemy was struggling, now was the time to deliver the knockout punch. Troglita was hesitant, but under the insistence of his subordinates, he took action and initiated battle. As the Romans charged across the stream, the Moors retreated into a wooded brush, concealing their location and their numbers. The terrain also limited the Roman cavalry mobility and left them vulnerable to ambush. The result was a disaster. The Moors routed the Roman army and sent them into a disorganized retreat. Troglita was at one point knocked from his horse and forced to fight off Moorish advances in hand-to-hand combat while running for his life. The Roman army regrouped at Aribindis, and in the spring of 548, Troglita once again marched into Byztory. The Moors ran the exact same play that they ran in 547. They retreated into the desert and dared the Romans to pursue. This time, Troglita did not follow blindly. He found a freshwater source and made camp to ensure that his men were rested and supplied. It seemed like Troglita had plugged the holes that sunk the campaign of 547, but apparently his men didn't quite see it that way. To them, this looked all too familiar. Out in the desert, chasing an enemy that was constantly on the run, and suffering from the scorching summer heat. Some of Troglita's officers started to grumble, and suddenly the Roman camp was in mutiny. Other officers tried to throw water on the fire, but to no avail. The camp's anger was only calmed when Troglita himself heard of their displeasure and addressed the men directly. He appealed to their sense of patriotism, claiming that the native Africans in his ranks were more Roman than they were. If Roman fidelity has so utterly abandoned your souls, well then, I shall wage war now with these native tribes. Our allies will always be loyal to our cause. As for you, you gang of cowards, get out of my camp. Go. I can't think of another example of an ancient general calling his own men cowards to their faces like this. Contrast this with Belisarius' style. He would never call his men out like this. He might appeal to their sense of honor and duty, but he would also acknowledge their grievances. But Troglita outright scolds them. If you don't want to be here fighting for Rome, then get out. We don't need you anyway. It's cutting, but it's also effective. The men in North Africa had been stuck in the mud for years, and this might have been just the kick that they needed to get going. Troglita's words calmed the mutiny, and the responsible officers were accordingly punished. And now back in full control of his men, Troglita advanced on the Moors, who were camped on the fields of Cato. He surrounded the enemy camp to prevent them from accessing additional supplies, and he instructed his men to act disinterested in battle, which would have been a familiar sight for the Moors, given everything they'd seen over the last several years. Believing that the Romans were demoralized, the Moors attacked, and were met with fierce resistance. The ensuing battle was long and bloody, but the Romans emerged victorious. The Moors suffered heavy losses. 17 of their chieftains were killed, one at Troglita's own hand. Antyllus also surrendered and swore allegiance to the empire. The remaining rebels broke and ran off into the desert. With so many of their chieftains gone, there would not be further organized resistance. The Moorish rebellion was finally over. John Troglita returned to Carthage and remained in control of the Roman military operations in the prefecture until the 550s. There was no need for future campaigns. 15 years after Belisarius had landed on its shores, North Africa was finally at peace. Troglita helped ensure future tranquility by negotiating with the Moorish tribes and making them federati. Aside from a very brief revolt in 563 that was almost immediately put down, the region would be at peace for the rest of Justinian's reign. Because of Justinian's conquest, parts of North Africa would remain a part of the Roman Empire until falling to the Islamic conquests in 698. In total, North Africa was in Roman hands for 7.5 centuries, from the Third Punic War until the Vandal invasion, and then once again from Belisarius' invasion until 698. Over those 7.5 centuries, North Africa was rich and prosperous. It's one of the reasons that Justinian wanted to bring the region back into his empire. Unfortunately, the prolonged war hindered North Africa's economy. Farms were trampled, citizens struggled, economic activity slowed, and the resulting tax revenue was not as stellar as Justinian would have hoped. The arrival of the Justinianic plague in the 540s also had a big impact on the North African economy. Coropas wrote of the plague, "Never before had so sad a sound of death been heard." As it did everywhere it went, the plague greatly affected the local population and reduced its economic output. And while Justinian can't be held responsible for the spread of this deadly disease, his poor management directly prolonged the war. And it's both the war and the plague that limited prosperity. It's unrealistic to expect the emperor to have kept Belisarius in North Africa indefinitely after 534. Even if the war in Italy never happened, Belisarius would have been needed in the east. There is no world where he stays in Carthage and manages the province. But for every competent successor to Belisarius, like Solomon or Troglita, there were duds like Sergius and Aribindis. These poor leaders were also dealt a bad hand due to the constantly late and short imperial payments for their soldiers. That was a problem that arose shortly after the conquest was completed and lasted all the way through the 530s and 540s. Once you've created an environment where the army is unpaid and soldiers are deserting or even mutinying, you're going to have a very hard time righting the ship. Morale matters. Organization matters. Emperors need to keep their own men, their own administrators, and their own generals in line in order to prevent these cracks from forming, because once they do, you're already fighting an uphill battle. Great leaders can clean it up, but you don't have an infinite supply of Troglitas or Belisariuses. Mixing in less capable men worsens the problem. But despite the 15 years of struggles, the North African economy would recover once peace was achieved. By the time that Justinian died in 565, Carthage, and Leptis Magna in particular, seemed to have regained their status as major trading hubs on the Mediterranean. The prefecture was able to contribute new recruits to the Roman army, and those recruits fought in Italy and on the eastern frontier. While it seems unlikely that the number of men North Africa contributed to the military were enough to fully offset the amount of men that needed to be continuously stationed there, it at least seems to have kept pace, which is far more than can be said for Italy. The conquest was also a symbolic victory, the first major Roman expansion following the collapse of imperial authority in the West. That would have been a big deal to citizens of the empire in the 530s. In North Africa, we see a bit of a mixed bag, but overall, a beneficial conquest. We also see that the Roman Empire was not going to just fade away as the 6th century marched on and antiquity transitioned into the Middle Ages. But at the same time, we see that nothing was going to come easy, that initial successes might not be lasting, and that expansion would have long-term effects on the empire as a whole. Africa was Justinian's first reconquest, and it was the clearest lesson that winning a province is far easier than keeping it.